great pleasure to welcome all of you here. I am also delighted that we are at a cusp in the policy formulation stage in various parts of the world, but particularly in the US. And consequently, the pledge that was part of President-elect Joe Biden's plan on moving towards a zero carbon economy by 2050 is now to be put in place. And I think there's no better time to discuss this. I'm absolutely delighted at the lineup of speakers we have today. Antha Williams from the Bloomberg Foundation, Carla Frisch from the Rocky Mountain Institute, my good friend for many, many years, Nate Hartman, now with the University of Maryland. Andrew, how we worked together in Paris is something I cannot forget. Andrew, now with WRI. Emmanuel, are you here? Emmanuel, who I take as, in a sense, don't get me wrong, this is purely a word. It's not, I'm not reflecting on what it means. Eminence Grace of the movement towards a zero climate future. Leon Clark, also from the University of Maryland. And of course, my extremely good friend, mentor, and somebody who, every time I talk to him, I learn something, including from his book, Navroz Dabash. We have a great lineup. We are looking, as I said, at a future in which we are looking at things which are going to be very different from what they were yesterday. We also fully realize that with the COVID-19 pandemic, the kinds of things that the Biden campaign wanted to do will now take a longer time. We also fully realize that undoing what has been done in the past 4 years under this administration will also take time to undo. Nevertheless, it's a breath of fresh air. And I really look forward to us discussing how we go ahead. We are in great times. We are in times when the EU has announced that they would go carbon neutral by 2050. Japan and South Korea have said so, also 2050. China has said 2060. In other words, there are goals globally. However, the point that I'd like to make is that there are two parts to it. One is having a goal, the other is having a pathway to go there. And I think the EU, I am told, is working on a pathway. They're looking at a 55% reduction by 2030. Let's see what actually happens. But the two things together, a pathway and a goal, or let me put it the other way around, a goal and a pathway which leads to that goal together, I think make a huge difference. We at Paris, India made the pledge, which climate transparency says is the only G20 pledge which is in line with the 2-degree goal. I mean, I'm sure we want it to be a little more ambitious and go closer to 1.5 than 2. But the point remains that we would like to see that the pathways of all countries reflect a movement towards at least a 2-degree future, if not a 1.5-degree global warming future. So I am particularly interested in, as is everybody on this call, particularly interested in finding out how we move ahead to an American future where America again takes the lead in cutting down on its own emissions and in providing the global lead for other countries to do so as well. I am delighted that the America's Pledge, as it's called, we have Nate Hartman who will take us through it. And then we will go in for a discussion with others, including Andrew, including Emmanuel, Leon, and Navroz. But before I do that, let me turn it over to Antha from Bloomberg Philanthropies, who has been at the heart of putting together the coalition that has led to this pledge. Antha, all yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mathur, and really appreciate your incredible leadership on these issues. And thanks to everyone for being here, especially so late in the evening, just before Diwali. It speaks to all of our commitment to these issues. So, as Dr. Mathur said, we're here at a really historic moment, and I liked the comment that you made that it's a breath of fresh air. It very much feels that way. You know, the election of President-elect Joe Biden, he comes into this having made stronger commitments on climate change than any president or presidential candidate in the history of our country. And so we're really delighted about the opportunity that affords. And at the same time, it's quite clear that these issues are more pressing and urgent than ever. The COVID-19 pandemic, which of course is moving quickly and accelerating through our country, has demonstrated the multiple crises that we face of economic recession, the pandemic itself, inequality, and of course climate change, as we're seeing the wildfires from California to Colorado and elsewhere, and extreme weather events along the Gulf Coast. It's the need to act now is quite clear. But as Dr. Mathur mentioned, we're here today to discuss the global politics in light of the pandemic, the recession, and the U.S. elections. So just a quick moment on the history of the America's Pledge effort. In 2017, in the aftermath of Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, Michael Bloomberg, my boss, and then California Governor Jerry Brown launched America's Pledge. And I'm getting a fair amount of feedback. I don't know if those who aren't speaking could just mute themselves. I don't know if you can hear me okay, but it may be difficult for some. Thank you so much. So Michael Bloomberg and then California Governor Jerry Brown launched the America's Pledge effort to ensure that local progress would continue in the U.S. Despite the rhetoric from Washington. And since then, an incredible coalition of nearly 4,000 climate leaders from across the United States, including cities, businesses, states, colleges and universities, faith groups, tribal associations, and others have affirmed their commitment to accomplishing our climate change targets. And America's Pledge analyzes and presents those data to the United Nations and the world. The most recent analysis, which you'll hear more about, shows that the Biden administration now inherits a very strong basis on which to build for their climate commitments. And bottom-up leadership in the U.S. has kept us on a path to progress. Just a couple quick examples. In 2017, when this was launched, only one state and 22 cities had committed to 100% renewable energy, just one state and 22 cities. Now that's up to 13 states and 130 cities that have made those commitments to 100% renewable energy. So our analysis is showing that U.S. cities, states, and businesses are on track to reduce emissions by 37% by 2030. And with added federal action and ambition, the U.S. could achieve nearly 50% emissions reductions by 2030. So alongside these efforts in the U.S., of course, we've seen global recognition increasing that climate is a challenge that can be solved by only if we gather our broadest coalitions together. It can't just be national governments alone. And action from businesses, cities, states, and citizens working together will really be required. So we look forward to doubling down to supporting increased ambition and renewed national government ambition, of course, here in the United States, as well as working with many of our partners, including those here in India and around the world. So I will wrap there and listen really to our experts here that share the conclusions of this really important and excellent research. And thank you again for having us, for joining us, and for your time and attention today.
We are delighted. I need to. I was. Okay. We are delighted to have this opportunity to partner with you and Bloomberg Philanthropies in bringing this together. And I don't think we could have better timing. So let me immediately turn to Nate. Nate, it would be delightful for us to have you walk us through the America's Pledge. All yours.
So thank you very much, Dr. Mathur, and also Terry for hosting this. It's really a great pleasure for us to be able to share some of the thinking and work that we've been doing over the past few years to understand what's possible in the United States and how the subnational action that Antha mentioned and described in some detail can actually build a stepped up basis for an all-in national climate strategy. And so what I, along with my co-lead, Carla Frisch, will be doing today is to walk you through some of our recent thinking and results from recent reports from America's Pledge, and then we'll put it in a context. And then later, Leon Clark, of an international discussion around raising global ambition. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We have a few PowerPoint slides that I'll walk us through to give us a better sense of what that research looks like. So let me make sure I can get that up. And you should all be seeing a first slide. If that's not the case, let me know. Speak up. So Antha Williams described to you all a little bit about the history of the last few years with this movement of subnational actors who have essentially taken leadership over the past few years as the federal government has essentially stepped back from climate leadership. And our work with America's Pledge has been to better understand and communicate what that work is, and also to encourage additional ambition from those actors, and at the right time, which may be upon us, to encourage a stronger partnership with the federal government to raise ambition from the United States as a whole. Now, none of us here is representing the Biden-Harris team, but I did want to sort of recognize the moment that we're in, which is that we've just elected a new president of the United States, and I copied this just as a screenshot from the Biden-Harris transition website. And I wanted to just note, in framing the work that we're going to be talking about today, that this new incoming administration has placed climate change as one of its top 4 priorities that's being kind of communicated and built into their transition plan, as well as their overall governing strategy. So we're not going to dwell too much on that because this is not about exactly the Biden-Harris strategy. But I just wanted to recognize all of us have been, I'm sure, following this election very closely. And I think we'll have a little bit of time to talk about that context as well. But returning to the kind of task at hand, one thing that we want to do is also communicate to this group and to kind of share some of the insight that we've gotten in the past few years about what subnational action in the United States means, not only for emissions in the near term, but also, as Dr. Mathur kind of framed up, how does it actually affect our ability to be more ambitious for the long run? And I think what we have discovered in the United States is that these subnational actors, in many ways, may be one of the keys for us to kind of build a longer term, more robust, and more ambitious climate strategy. And some of the work that we've done, which we'll share with you today, gets at why we think that is the case. But before we do that, I wanted to kind of put a couple of graphics up here about who it is that we're talking about. If you've been following this movement, kind of from afar, there's all these names and symbols and logos. But just to kind of note, there are many coalitions that are working together as part of the subnational community. We're going to hear part of America's Pledge, Carla is part of America's Pledge, Andrew, Leon, and Antha, but there's also a number of other partners that have been working here, including We Are Still In, which is primarily a coalition of subnational actors, the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is more focused only on state governors in a bipartisan way, city mayors, and also businesses. And even this figure, I would note, doesn't show all of the coalitions. It shows kind of the major ones, but there are many others who have been participating in this. One other piece of context just to note for you all, this was an announcement that was given, I'm not going to read through all the word for word, but by America's Pledge and We Are Still In the day after the election, when the results were still unclear. They are now clear, but at that point they were not. And I think what I want to note from this statement is the strong interest in the subnational community in continuing to build out on the leading edge of climate ambition in sometimes ways that maybe the federal government will not be able to do. And so that's one thing just to keep in mind as we're talking about this issue, that these actors remain committed to doing more and working with the federal government as the federal government starts to act on this topic as well. So one other small sort of institutional note, as you heard from Antha, Bloomberg Philanthropies has been a key partner in sort of helping keep this movement together and providing support in various ways. The three organizations that have done the research work that you're going to be seeing are my own, but also Rocky Mountain Institute. You'll hear from Carla in a minute, as well as the World Resources Institute. And these three institutions were co-equal partners this work together, and it was a wonderful team of, at some points, over 30 people working on these analyses. Now, for those of you who are research inclined, don't spend a lot of time reading all these details, but the point here is just to say there is a lot of work that is available if you want to dig deeper into what we've done. You can just go to our website and download any of these reports and take a deeper look. And again, I won't go through all the details of the different reports, but there is a lot of work here. We've spent a lot of time innovating on research methodologies for how to understand better how these things link together, but also doing engagement with our communities, and sort of this is representative of that as well. So just to note, there's more there. So now just to get to kind of our general overall philosophy or theory of change here, which should actually be probably quite familiar to all of you. That we look at raising global climate ambition as a kind of function of three interlinking processes. The ones that people often naturally focus on, of course, are the international negotiations like the COPs, the Framework Convention, Paris Agreement. Obviously, those are critical. They're critical for coordination, for communication, for raising global ambition together. We now have a good architecture in Paris that allows us to do this work. And that architecture, of course, relies on national actions. National actions are another obvious place that people look for understanding how global climate ambition can be raised. Each country now under Paris decides about its own national strategy and then reports that up to the Paris Agreement and other countries. But one of the pieces that I think in many ways has been underappreciated, but we, I think in the US very much have learned from the past few years of experience here, is that bottom-up climate action that happens not at just the national level, but at states, cities, businesses, regional bodies of various kinds. This kind of action is critical to building the platform and the basis on which national action can happen. Now, all countries are different. It's going to look different in India than the US. It's going to look different in China than the US. But in the same way, we all know that in some ways, in our own political context, this bottom-up action is always going to be critical. And so one of the key questions that we've been investigating in the context of the US is how this action manifests in the United States political system and how we can build more upon it. So I'm going to walk very briefly through a few sort of give a sense of the scale and impact of the bottom-up action that we've been seeing over the past couple of years in the United States. This map is a very easy way to start thinking about it. If you look at the map on the right, you see a lot of dots and a lot of shaded in states. What those are states, cities, and other entities that have stepped up to say, as we say, we are still in for the Paris Agreement. As of now, there are roughly 4,000 actors who have stepped up to say they are going to be doing or are currently doing work to support climate ambition in some way in their own jurisdictions or in their own organizations. Now, that in and of itself is fascinating. 4,000 individual leaders, individual actors, state legislatures, and more stepping up to say they are in. But I think we have to pause and say, while it is fantastic that there are so many actors, the critical question for the US and for, frankly, other countries in the global climate is how big of a difference do these actors actually make? And so that was part of the goal of our America's Pledge work, to understand and communicate that impact. So the next slide I'll show is a sense of the scale of these actors. So one way to think about it is how much of a fraction of US emissions do they represent? They actually represent over 50% of US emissions. They represent over 65% of the US population, and they represent nearly 70% of US GDP. Now, that GDP is significant. If it were its own country, it would be equivalent to the world's second largest economy, roughly the size of China's economy. So these actors, not only are there many of them, but the scale of potential action is great. Now, the final question in our logical sequence here is whether that scale of action can actually translate to real policies that actually make a difference in emissions. And this was really, in some ways, the hardest part of the work that we did to understand what their scope of action really is, what policy levers they have at their disposal, and how, in some ways, how hard they're pulling on those levers to make sure that there's something important happening in their jurisdictions. And that was where we actually found surprising and interesting results, which is that deliver significant emissions reductions even on its own, even without federal action. And that's what this particular figure shows. I'm not going to walk through everything here, but just to note, the middle bar there called current measures represents how much action has already been committed to by these cities, states, businesses, and others. And what we found is that just based on current measures, these actors are able to achieve a roughly 25% reduction in the US greenhouse gas emissions trajectory by 2030. Now, that in itself is interesting and significant. Even more interestingly, expanded action that is similar to the trends we have been seeing over the past couple of years, that rapid growth that Antha talked about in her initial comments, for example, going to 100% clean electricity, those kinds of goals, very rapidly increasing. So we asked the question, if those trends continue and things that were thought to be leaders only became kind of the norm across many of these states, what could be potentially achieved? And that's where we got this projection of thinking about 37% reductions by 2030 from, again, just the subnational community alone. Now, the critical step here, and this goes back to also Ajay's comments at the beginning, is how we get the United States on a track that is comparable roughly with a 2 or even ideally a 1.5 degree compatible trajectory. And this is where everybody recognizes the federal government is critical. We cannot do this with just bottom-up actors. They can do a lot. They can create a stepped-up basis for increased federal action, but they cannot get us all by themselves on this pace. But with the federal government, both the executive, and in this case, we modeled also congressional action, which is a critical point here. With the executive and congressional action, we projected we could get up to 49%, almost 50% reductions by 2030, partnering with strong action from the federal government. And so that's kind of the overall sort of assessment that we've been able to do over the past couple of years. At this point, what I want to kind of note is that we've also been in a very strange year in 2020, not only the election, but also all of the other things that have been happening globally. And so we did take some time this year to assess how those pretty big challenges were going to be affecting the US's ability to reduce emissions. And to tell you more about that, I'm going to hand over to Carla Frisch, my co-lead on this, to talk more about that.
So glad to be with you. I'm Carla Frisch with Rocky Mountain Institute. And of course, I work closely with Rocky Mountain Institute India, which I know is a partner of many of yours, and I'm really glad to be on with you today. And particularly with our Rocky Mountain Institute India work, we've got the Global Cooling Prize underway, which is already bringing in some early results with cooling that's 5 times more efficient. So really, really looking forward to that. So as Nate was saying, we were looking into the details of what's really happening on the ground in the US. So since 2017, when these movements started getting quite organized, particularly around the announcement of the US intent to withdraw from Paris, electric vehicles have doubled in the United States. 16 states have committed to hydrofluorocarbon phase down. That's a highly impactful global warming pollutant using coolants. And 16 states is almost like a de facto federal standard because manufacturers don't want to have 2 different products. On 100% clean energy commitments, in 2017, there was just 1 state. Now there's 13 states and Puerto Rico, 165 cities, and more than 30 cities have already achieved 100% clean energy. So we're really seeing both the commitments coming in and the follow through to achieve those commitments. Interestingly, 7 states and 27 gas companies have committed to methane leak reduction. And a new trend has been in the realization that buildings need to be all electric, using that clean electricity very efficiently. So with new policies, now 6 million people in the US live in cities that require all electric, highly efficient new construction. And all of this has been underpinned by a real shift in public opinion in the US. So at this point, 79% of Americans think that the US should prioritize moving the energy supply towards renewable energy. So really some amazing on the ground action. Next slide. So as Nate mentioned, we are around the world living in unprecedented times with the pandemic and the recession. And we thought, that might be slowing down climate action in the US. So we undertook a deep look at what's really happening in 2020. And that's what we'd like to share with you on the next slide. So we track actions month by month. And what surprised me is right in the heart of the pandemic, as it was hitting different cities, we had Houston, Texas, Kansas City step up and say, actually, at this moment in time, climate action is even more important because we understand the connection between climate and health and our own city budgets. And we know that moving to renewables is actually going to save us money. So we've seen a continued drumbeat of action even during COVID and the economic recession. Next slide. So from an academic perspective, we went deep. We looked at what are the key drivers affecting emissions, what is the direction and the extent of recent trends, and what's the potential to really affect emissions reductions in 2030? Because we're looking out to what's possible for the US, particularly with the new federal leadership. And I won't go through all the research that you see there on the right, but on the next slide, you can see the top line takeaway, which is that despite COVID, despite an economic recession, our assessment increases our confidence in the ability of US states, cities, and businesses to deliver on the bottom-up action model. So we actually are more confident in climate action than we were before. Next slide. And importantly, that's underpinned by public opinion. So you may be watching some of the election results coming in the US, and it looks like a bit of a 50-50 split. And that's not the case on clean energy. So more than 70% of Americans support 100% clean economy by 2050. They support requiring utilities to generate clean electricity. They support stronger fuel efficiency standards. So this is a top priority for Americans across the political spectrum. Next slide. So if you'd like to learn more about any of this, you can find it at americaspledge.com with the two reports we've just released, Achieving Climate Progress in 2020 focusing on this year, and then a retrospective of looking back at what the movement has achieved during the last 4 years. So very happy to be here with you today. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Carla. Nate and Carla, thank you very much for walking us through the analysis. And I think a lot of people are now going to be reading the reports that you mentioned. But I think the most important part of it is the analysis that went into it, the kind of rigor with which this was prepared. And I want to thank you. Nate mentioned that it involved developing new methodologies. That's something that we look forward to, because the chain of actions that you talked about is really something where I do think not only in the US, but across the world, we need to apply these new methodologies. But the election also promises a new set of relationships. Or is it Obama too? I don't think that we can have anybody better than Andrew Light to talk about this. Andrew, would love to hear from you how the election results would now start a new phase in the US leadership in global climate politics.
Thank you very much, Ajay. It is so great to be part of this session with you and all my other friends here today. You know, many of you know that when I was in the U.S. State Department in the second Obama term, I had responsibility for the U.S.-India climate relationship, and I was back and forth to Delhi and other parts of India constantly. I miss all of you. I've been thinking about all of you, and just, you know, really hoping that you're all doing well in the midst of the multiple crises that we're all going through right now. But Ajay is right. We have reason to look forward to a future now, and a very good one, I think. So I'm going to make just 5 points, try to keep this relatively brief, and then we can layer in more in the discussion. To be clear, if it's unclear at all, number one, Joe Biden, as president, rejoins the Paris Agreement on day one. And I think that's January 20th, that's Inauguration Day, just a couple of months away. It's very good news we got last night that he selected Ron Klain, his longtime advisor, as his new chief of staff. The chief of staff is one of the most important positions in the federal government. And I think that we can be sure then, because Ron has said so many great, interesting things, very much sees especially the connections between health and health security and climate change, has been very clear about that, has strong connections to the climate community across the board. And so I think that's a very good signal, again, of the reaffirmation of exactly what Nate said earlier about the central place of climate in this new administration. There are other things that Biden can do on the first day. We can talk about that later. The president has immense control over, for example, procurement. The U.S. federal government is very large, like the Indian government, and there's just tons of things that can be done in terms of changing the nature of how federal properties are dealt with, how federal lands are dealt with, how vehicles are purchased that can have enormous influence in the United States. Secondly, as Ajay said, the Biden administration, Joe Biden has already committed to net zero emissions in 2050. And you saw this evolution, an astonishing degree of new commitments that came out from the first Biden climate plan that was released in the summer of 2019 to 2 more that were released in the summer of 2020, including increasing the commitment to $2 trillion in spending over 4 years, which is a substantial amount. You really saw a lot how the different parts of the Democratic Party came to the same common vision on climate change, the importance of it, and the scale of response that's needed both domestically and internationally. With respect to the global move out there, I mean, rejoining Paris is a relatively straightforward process. On January 20th, Joe Biden just sends a note, to the Secretary General and says the United States is going to rejoin. But as we know, those who were involved, like Ajay, myself, and others who were in this meeting, who were working on the Paris Agreement, to be a party in good standing, you have to have a commitment under the Paris Agreement. And the United States will need to put out another commitment to the Paris Agreement to replace the one that we put out in 2025. And that is where, the structure of Paris, which is built on these nationally determined contributions, means that what happens domestically in the United States with respect to climate policy, of course, impacts the world. And I think there's some challenges we have in front of us, but also, as Nate and Carla just showed us, we have this enormous advantage with the Biden administration that we did not have when Obama started in 2009. So I don't think this is a reset at all, because the amount of non-federal action on climate change has been so enormous, growing consistently so much, that you really do have something very strong, a very strong foundation there that Biden can build on that Obama just did not have access to in 2009. So I think that what you're going to see is a couple different ways of trying to do this. I was very interested to see the news overnight on the new stimulus package that's just been announced in India. I think this is the first one you've had since May. Similar situation in the United States. We have not had a stimulus plan in response to the coronavirus pandemic, as well as the economic downturn, since last summer. And I do not see that there's any chance that we're going to see one in what's called the lame duck period between the election and inauguration on January 20th. And so with that, there's going to be a lot of pressure on this. I mean, Americans have not had a stimulus check come into their bank accounts. They have not had an extension, a federal extension of their unemployment benefits. And with the pandemic really coming back in full force here in the United States, and potentially more shutdowns happening in the economy, you could see more people out of work again. We're reaching the limitations of extensions in the sort of the safe harbor that was given on people not being able to pay their mortgages and their rents. And so there will be ample reasons why we're going to have to do a new stimulus package. If Joe Biden can do the same thing that Barack Obama did with our 2009 stimulus, which was $800 billion, I would expect the next stimulus in the US would be even bigger. And what Obama did was he got 10% of that, a little bit more, $80 to $100 billion went to clean energy, the biggest energy bill ever passed in one stroke in the United States. It did an enormous amount to begin the downward trajectory of US emissions in the United States, perhaps more than many other policies that were passed during the Obama administration. And so if we can get more senators to recognize the need for the stimulus, I think you're going to see a very strong push by the Biden administration, and perhaps a successful one that could go towards that. I would say that thinking about what Nate and Carla just went through, there's a very strong potential here, and we've been thinking about it on our team, about how much of that stimulus could be clean energy packages that are directed at the states, at the cities, incentivizing those states and cities that are not yet there, and potentially helping them to even reach more potential with their emission reductions. And that's where you can see the kind of communication between state leaders and their senators in Washington, even Republican senators, if it's the case that the Republicans hold on to the Senate, which we don't know yet. We won't know that until January 5th, when two races are rerun in the state of Georgia. But we'll really see some communication that could get more support for that kind of thing. And then we'll see it come again in the spring when we do our budget policies in the United States, our big budget deals, where actually the threshold for success is lower. It's not as high as a normal bill in the Senate, and on and on and on. More very specific pieces of legislation, such as a bipartisan bill that's been working for a long time on hydrofluorocarbons, that would really expand what states are doing on HFCs that Carla mentioned before. There are many opportunities here where I think we're going to see this state foundation can actually see an acceleration of federal action, even if you have Republicans in the Senate who are not as enamored of this kind of action. Thirdly, on finance, and I think, well, just to back up 1 second, of course, that cluster of action then becomes the foundation for a new U.S. commitment to the Paris Agreement, and I think can show then what will be the trajectory that Biden will be able to put out there between 2030 and 2050 when he wants to get to net decarbonization or lay the foundation for it. Thirdly, on finance, the Biden plan is very clear that he wants to recommit to the Green Climate Fund, which everyone kind of reads as effectively entailing making good on the $2 billion that the United States left on the table and was never able to sort of get across the finish line in the Obama administration. He's got a lot in his plans on green debt relief, and I know there's a lot of interest in this on the European side as well. It'd be interesting to see how those parties move together. And most importantly, I think with respect to the US-India relationship, one of the big hallmarks of our finance work with India was using our development finance institutions like the Overseas Private Investment Corporation and the Export-Import of the Bank of the United States to really drive through and support the targets of the last two Indian governments, really, on clean energy. And I think we'll see an acceleration of that, and the Biden plan is very clear on wanting to make sure there's no fossil fuel investment that's going to happen there, and a plus up of what's being done with respect to clean energy. Fourthly, I think that we're going to see that in terms of a very particular focus on China. The way I like to put this to people is that President Trump and President-elect Biden now were kind of on different planets when it came to the Paris Agreement. President-elect Biden wanted to rejoin, and has been saying that consistently since he started running, rejoin Paris on day one. I don't really believe that President Trump didn't know that the US was not formally out of the Paris Agreement until the day after the election. I think he thought he did that in 2017. Completely different picture on China. I think in terms of foreign policy, one of the places where President Trump and President-elect Biden were really at loggerheads was who is going to be tougher on China and who's going to work through the many difficulties we have with the Chinese now. That's just how they played it out, and you saw this in the election. And one of the things that President-elect Biden was very clear on is he's very concerned about China's Belt and Road Initiative, and especially the amount of fossil infrastructure spending that's gone on through the Belt and Road Initiative. And he said that he wants to create an alliance of parties and other institutions to offer BRI countries some kind of alternative to the fossil funding that they're getting from Belt and Road. So look for that as a very important play. And finally, the last thing I'll say is Biden has this more amorphous pledge that we saw with a few other select Democrats who ran during the campaign to make climate a center of US foreign policy. That's a big aspiration. It's not entirely clear what that means in terms of the implications of it. But I think just to focus on India for a second, and there was a very interesting article in the Hindustan Times this morning that featured an interview with Alyssa Ayres, who was a senior State Department official with responsibility over India today. And it mostly focused on security, but she said very clearly, right, that climate and energy was also going to be a big part of that. And so what I would expect to see is we had 15, and Ajay, you did a lot of work on this, 15 different programs of climate energy cooperation with India. I would expect to see that the US comes back in and says, let's go through those again. Let's see what we can do. And let's see if what can the United States do to help India with its own nationally determined targets. Now, China is getting a lot of play right now because of a big announcement President Xi made at the UN General Assembly this past, just a couple of months ago. But Prime Minister Modi made an equally big announcement a year ago at the UN General Assembly in saying that he wants to see 450 gigawatts of installed clean energy capacity in India by 2030. The question that the US and other allies need to think through is what does it take for India to succeed there? What will that mean? And how can that be the foundation of our new relationship as a cornerstone of our overall bilateral relationship? So thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Extremely useful. We look at the domestic actions driving global change as well. And I think as far as relationships are concerned, yes, of course, we realize that it's not Obama day 4 years plus one. We have a lot of events that have happened in the 4 years since, and we are at a different point. And I think it just makes sense to take stock of that, see what are the kinds of hooks that are now available for the relationship to move on. Thank you very much. We now move to Emmanuel Guerin, who has been, let's say, working together with a large number of actors on putting together European and global energy climate perspectives. And Emmanuel, it would be great if you could share with us what are the implications of the EU net zero package for all of us. All yours, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Ajay, and good to see you again since yesterday. Let me maybe start by asking if it is better if I stop sharing my video, because some of you were cutting out a bit previously, but I was not sure if the problem was coming at my end or your end. So you tell me. I'm happy to show you my face, but if it's an obstacle to the message being delivered clearly, happy to turn off the video as well.
Emmanuel, it's fine now. Why don't you go ahead? If we have a problem, we'll get back to you.
Excellent. It's a very to have the real conversation and be honest with ourselves and try and confront the big issues. So I'll try to cut short and go straight to the points that I'd love to discuss with our Indian colleagues. But just a little bit of a perspective from Europe. And I'm happy to do that, by the way. I mean, most of the time I engage with you in those conversations more from a global perspective, but I'm very happy to talk as a European today. And that's in particular because I think there is a sense happening in Europe at the moment that we are in a very different situation from before. And that's on two things that are directly relevant to the conversation that we're having today. One is that, and we shouldn't take it lightly because it's not been just announced when the European Commission and Parliament were first appointed or elected. It was also reconfirmed, in fact, with strengthened emphasis as part of the recovery plan. The Green Deal is the European top political priority, which means a lot. And I think sometimes we're failing to grasp all of the implications of that, but we're very much seeing that from the inside in Europe, and in particular the fact that the conversation has completely changed from a few years before. So of course we continue having these sectoral policy discussions, right? I mean, what is it that you do in transport? What is it that you do in industry, in energy? So all of that, it continues, but we already kind of knew the politics of that. We're getting through the politics of doing that with the finance sector, like big deal and real time with the taxonomy, and that's a very different sector than the others, and we're also the politics and the macroeconomics of the Green Deal in a way that was non-existent before. So all of that are huge shifts happening profoundly in Europe that will not go back, that's for sure. I mean, the train has left the station, so there is a profound sense of inevitability in Europe with regard to that transformation. Obviously, as there should, as to the speed of the transformation. I'd like to highlight one thing, which is, potentially a car crash or a good thing, depending on how it's managed. And that's why I think this group is also very useful, which is that in June, the Commission will submit options to the Council of European Heads of States and Government with regards to a possible border carbon adjustment mechanism. And some people look at it in exactly the right way in Europe, that would be close to the views of this group, and so an instrument that is definitely not around protectionism, really targeted at some issues and done in consultation with key players, including the US, including China, including India, etc., etc. But some of the others are not. So I think there is a lot that this group, the others, need to be mobilized around in Europe in the next few months to make sure that the debate on trade and the environment, which I'm sure everybody will agree is critically important, actually turns out to be the opportunity it can, and not the failure of the international aviation that we've seen in the past. I honestly don't think Europe will repeat its mistake, because that's the other good news for me. The end of the era of naivete for Europe on the geopolitical front. And it's to see how I think most of Europe is looking at the election in the US and the election of Biden as, of course, like such a relief and such a good news if and since that will hold, even if that takes time for some people to process. Europe doesn't feel shaken at, say, in its ability to exert some global leadership in the context of Biden being elected president. I mean, it is viewed as a renewed option for Europe to exert global leadership with the US and with others, and that's where I'd like to leave it with you, colleagues, and then turn to the discussion, because I frankly, I hear some worrying ideas, quite practical ones, being floated these days in some parts of the UK and some parts of the US, and I know that they do not reflect the views of this group, but I think they should be considered very seriously, because at least as far as I can see, there's some political traction. The will basically, include India and exclude China, and of course include the US and include Europe and Australia and South Korea. But for me is way too plainly, obviously an anti-China club that it's a good idea to play with. And I don't know if you're feeling the same, that there are lots of movements, of course, in the world of foreign policy at the moment, and lots of big decisions about to be made. But since I know that so many of us are talking to those people, I'd like to make sure we're giving them the good advice and looking at the big picture, and not just on confrontational politics, which I don't think is. Look forward to discussion with you all, in particular to learn a bit more from our American friends. I've heard them and some other colleagues for the past few days Biden could do through executive orders on public is indeed huge, and on regulation of some specific sectors, and the financial sector was included in some remarks. One of those sectors where you could act by executive action, and I'd be curious to know how far you can go. And to our Indian colleagues on the line, I'd be really curious to get your honest response as to why the EU is underperforming so obviously in its bilateral relationship with India compared to China, for example, and how we need to look at it in the context of Brexit in particular, and the fact that India will always be part of the story. You fit into that is a really open question for me, and I'd very much welcome Ajay and Navroz and others' thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. I think you've laid on the table questions that I think concern all of us, whether it is the questions regarding China, whether it is the questions regarding the India-US, EU-China relationship, whether it is what is it that, how do we deal with people who have a different point of view in our own politics. But I think it's the absolute right time to turn to Leon Clark, who is the director of the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland, and ask him to focus on China and the Chinese net zero pledge and the implications it will have on the global energy transition. Leon, all yours.
Okay, great. And I have some slides I'm attempting to share. I think I should be able to do that. Let's see, are those coming through? It looks like it.
Yes.
Okay, great. Good. So I'm delighted to be part of this conversation as well. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'm looking forward to the conversation at the end. the discussion. So I'm going to do a couple of things. So first, I'm just going to step back real briefly and talk a little bit about the climate context and just remind everybody about that context as we think about the China's pledge as well as the other pledges that are in place. And then I'm going to discuss a little bit about China's pledge and the broad challenges that are associated with it in the long run, many of which are basically the challenges that we'll be seeing everywhere. So I'll be taking a little bit of a longer run perspective, somewhat different than some of the perspectives we've been hearing today or thus far. So let me just jump forward. So one always has to step back, as we've talked about the different pledges in the US, pledge in EU, we have a Japanese pledge, and think about what they mean in the context of global climate. Let me just step back to make the point that the basic theme of the Paris Agreement when it comes to mitigation is to limit temperature change to below 2 degrees and try and get to 1.5. And the literature on trying to get to 1.5 indicates pretty clearly that you need to get emissions down to 0 by around 2050. And there's a range of nuances around that. But what you can see is these emerging pledges, whether it's Japan, whether it's the EU, are designed in essence to match that goal. And then the question is, then does China's 2060 pledge also fit into that same context? And indeed it does. There's a range of intellectual nuances about 2050 versus 2060 versus 2055, but broadly speaking, China's pledge is largely consistent with the same broad goal that we have. So then the question is, what does that mean for China? What does it mean for the global energy system? And I just make a couple of points. Let's see if I can move this. So, as we look at the sorts of mitigation activities that we need to see in China, and globally, we've seen pretty much the same stuff in general. So the same basic issues emerge and the same basic strategies are going to have to be in place everywhere. And this includes basically five core strategies. One of them is decarbonizing electricity. A second is switching to electricity and end uses. A third is constraining demand growth. A fourth is storing CO2, and that's something folks have to remember that in the long run, that's going to be a big part of this. And then finally, constraining non-CO2 emissions. And every country, China, the US, India, and a consortium of countries, the EU, all will have to be going through exactly these same actions in the context. So in that sense, they're all really very much the same. But they raise a range of different challenges that are unique to each of the countries. And so I'll just make a couple of comments about China first. And I won't be going into the comments about the Belt and Road that Andrew was discussing, but more about China's domestic needs. So first off, in China, as in many countries, coal is an enormous issue. Just to put it on the table that in China, over 2.5 million workers are involved in coal mining and washing by the end of 2018. So it's an enormous part of the economy. 60% of the Chinese primary energy comes from coal. And so one of the most important challenges associated with the Chinese context is this phase out and approach to dealing with coal. And I'll also note that in this context, something that I think is relevant in the discussions we've been having about America's pledge, and I think it's relevant throughout the four regions that are represented here, is this notion that there's a regional character to this. So as you look across China, some regions are heavily invested in coal, others are not, or heavily dependent on coal. And this slide is work that our colleagues here at the Center for Global Sustainability did, looking at the coal phase out in China. And what you can see is different provinces will have to be phasing out coal very differently. This is showing the coal capacity that would need to be phased out at three different scenarios, but the most important in the context of China's recent pledge is the 1.5 degree scenario, which is very consistent with the 2060 pledge. And what you see is a tremendously rapid phase out of coal that will be required for China to get on track. And this is something that's not unique, again, to China. India in the same situation where there may be some provinces that are, or excuse me, some states that are more heavily dependent on coal, and the same in the U.S. And so these regional dynamics have a very important effect on how to think about action. Obviously, the political dynamics and the political situations are very different in different countries, but the regional dynamics are extremely important. So coal will be an extremely important part of the Chinese change. I think at the same time, it's very important to note that in China, like most countries, there are also a range of potential benefits or potential synergies with action that are becoming increasingly important. And if you think about it, in the context of China, much of the interest now has been on air pollution. The sense at this point, which I think is consistent in others, is that the current air pollution standards in China will have, well, actually quite a bit has been done, let's put it that way, and some more can be done through about 2030 with current air pollution standards, some moderate improvements. But combining air pollution standards with climate mitigation has the ability to potentially meet the most stringent of the WHO standards. And so this linkage to air pollution, I think, is extremely important, will continue to be extremely important in the messaging and the strategy around China. And then more generally, what we see in the context of China, and I think, again, more broadly, is this notion, is there a holistic story around moving in this direction towards mitigation that tells where, it paints a picture of how China might move forward in a changing world. And I'll just point out that at present, China is already a leader in clean energy. Roughly 40% of all renewable jobs are in China, which is something like 4.5 million in 2019. In 2018 alone, in the first half, they produced 400,000 electric cars. It's roughly half of the global total. And so China is as it looks forward, is looking in a position of potential global leadership in the context of clean energy and clean energy development. And I think there's broad questions now as we think about China, but also about the U.S., frankly, and about any set of countries that are trying to address climate mitigation, is how do we see climate mitigation not as just an add-on to broader actions, but in some sense a foundation to these longer-term economic growth or development goals. And that I think is actually where a lot of the discussion is headed right now in terms of long-term strategy making in China. There's obviously tactical nuances of what goes into the 14th five-year plan and what would be specific policies or actions at both the national and provincial level. But there's also more broadly a sense of a need to articulate this larger growth story that will really drive both sort of public acceptance and governmental acceptance. So in terms of the broad implications, I would just say that China joining on with their own 2060 pledge, to the extent that all these countries take on what is an enormously large challenge of getting emissions down, has effects both in terms of the signaling that it does and what it signals for clean energy markets. And also it will continue to have effects on technology and innovation, as well as innovation in different policy and other approaches that I think will have very large implications for the globe in total. And of course, for those here, Andrew, Nate, and many of the people on this call who spend quite a bit of time thinking about international political dynamics, it of course puts a lot of pressure on the process, just as the US and China pledge together before the Paris Agreement, I think was very important in gaining momentum for the Paris Agreement. So it's just a couple of thoughts of China. I hope that's helpful, and I'm looking forward to the discussion to follow.
Thanks very much, Leon. I think the point that you made about the subnational character and the diversity of approaches is true across, I think, all the geographies who are here, whether it is China, whether it is the US, whether it's Europe, whether it's India. And I think it captures the central issue of in essence, the public opinion, the politics of what are the drivers, because the drivers in different provinces or different states would be different. And consequently, political leaders need to capture and link these drivers together with climate action. Thanks very much, Leon. Our final speaker is Navroz Dubash. Navroz, it would be great if you could comment on these strategies themselves, as well as on their implications for India. Navroz, all yours.
Great. Thank you, Ajay, and thank you so much for bringing me into this conversation with this fabulous panel, many of whom are old friends. I will try and comment a little bit on what my colleagues have said, what our colleagues have said, in the course of maybe sharing some perspectives on India. You know, I think we all agree this is a really significant moment, with the US potentially coming back in a fold, into the fold, in a sense, with the EU having made the announcements that it has in the context of COVID as well, and then these net zero commitments by South Africa, Korea, Japan, and so on and so forth. I think India has got used to being thought of more as a leader than a laggard in climate negotiations over the last few years, in broader climate discussions over the last few years. And I think we kind of like that feeling. So I think that there's a sort of a sense that, you know, it would be nice if that would continue. Taking off the nationalist hat and putting on the sort of more candid hat, I think part of the reason we have been seen as a leader is more because the world has moved backwards, and we've stayed more, you know, more or less in the same place. So let's be a little bit honest about that. The issue is, you know, what can India then do given this fact? And one of the things that we really have to think about is what is India going to do to maintain this position of leadership, and what can we do to strengthen it? And the obvious question on the table is India going to think about putting a net zero target on the table? That's sort of, you know, in the conversation here. And I just want to discuss that a little bit further and explore whether or not it would make sense in an Indian context, the kinds of things that we should be thinking about with regard to net zero. So, you know, net zero has some fabulous attributes. It leads to this kind of global signaling about sort of a collective sense of purpose. It potentially creates kind of a global norm. It may send signals to investors and industry. So those are all positives. Where I think we have to think a little bit harder is what net zero doesn't really help us achieve, particularly in a country like India. Now, the assumption that many of us, that people make when you talk about net zero is that there are sort of various forks in the road. We have a sense of where we need to go. And if we work backwards from net zero, we know which forks to avoid taking now. Now, that sort of narrative has never been particularly convincing to me because it assumes a whole institutional and technological and analytical machine that helps us make these hyper-rational decisions. So I don't know how much that will work, and certainly I don't think that will work in India. The second reason I'm a little concerned about this is that there is a real risk that the conversation about what we should do in 2060 and whether and what is a feasible conversation to have about that could crowd out what we should be doing now. And again, where capacity is thin, I think that crowding out is a real issue. And the third is that net zero risks being kind of political cover. So countries are being taken to the mat. They say, you know what, we'll do something in 2060, maybe even 2070. If India applies the China plus 10 rule, then we'll probably do what China does with a 10-year lag. How useful is a distant net zero target is really a question. And so, you know, I guess I don't want to sort of labor the point, but what I want to pivot to is where I think India could actually put something useful on the table. You know, where we have done well is in concrete short-term pivots in key areas where India is locking in infrastructure futures. You know, so renewable energy, thinking about batteries and electric vehicles and all these sorts of things. I mean, of course, there's space to go, but we have made some headway there, and I think it's worth us getting some recognition. What if India were to say, look, ambition gap, sure, net zero, sure, but can you guys, the rest of the world, please tell us what you're doing to bridge the implementation gap? How do we know that you're making progress in concrete 5-year increments as the Paris Agreement requires, and you're putting in place the domestic machinery? So one of the things we're doing at CPR is looking at domestic institutional structures in country after country. And very few countries have the sort of structure that China does or the UK does with its Climate Change Commission. And I'd be curious to hear from, for example, from Andrew as to whether the US is talking about some kind of coordinating institutional structure that will outlast these 4 or 8-year flip-flops in political parties. So what are you doing to bolster your decision-making and make it more robust? within countries. What also are you doing? And I think Emmanuel made this point in terms of sectoral shifts, right? So he said that there's a rich conversation happening, and I think that is an important conversation we need to continue. Leon mentioned air, and I think bridging air pollution and climate policy is an important story. In India, urbanization is an important story. So can we build a more elastic notion of what ambition is with a net zero target where it's really going to drive change in some countries, and I suspect it will in Europe, and at least an equivalent, if not greater, focus on an implementation gap where there are short-term, where countries are building out their infrastructures, even as we speak. Just two more quick points, if I might, Ajay. The third point I want to make is about finance. I was delighted to hear Andrew say that finance is squarely on the President-elect Biden's agenda, and that they're going to be talking about essentially meeting the international pledge that everybody's sort of looking to being met. I think this is going to be a really important conversation for all developing countries in a post-COVID era. We have incredibly tight fiscal constraints in India at the moment. The center is even scrambling with the states to actually give them what they're supposed to be giving in terms of the sharing of tax revenues. I think where some bridge financing at this point, given that fiscal issues are going to be a real consideration for the next few years, is going to be very, very important. So finance might actually move from being the kind of rhetorical conversation it has been for the last so many years in climate negotiations to actually being a practical conversation. Final point I'll make, and I want to pick up on Emmanuel's point about the geopolitics here. I think we have to be really careful of conversations that because of broader geopolitical tensions, and here, we're talking China, let's be very honest, we create fragmented political spaces. The climate future for the next 20 years is largely going to be driven by what Asia does. What Asia does is substantially going to be driven by what China does. After that, it's going to be Africa. What Africa does is also going to be substantially driven by China. India, I think, has to be part of global conversations. We have to be part of regional collaboration conversations, and in smaller, more practical ways. Asia has an interesting shared story about building the city of the future around a renewable energy transition. We have an interesting shared story about air pollution. Very interesting story, and I think a couple of people said this, including Andrew, about overseas aid. And how do we actually find some kind of common ground on overseas aid that induces more of that to be driven in the direction of social policy, as well as low carbon trajectories, rather than using the pipelines and the belts and the roads to shove obsolete last century technology. How exactly we do that? Of course, much harder in question, but I think it has to squarely be on the agenda. So I'll end with Ajay and look forward to the conversation. Thanks so much.
Many, many thanks, Navroz. And as always, I think the depth of analysis that you've brought in, the way you've unpacked the story, tells us of the kinds of questions that we need to ask ourselves in the future. But we have a number of questions that we have received from the audience. And let me begin with 3 questions. One of them is very, very Nate and Carla. The question focuses on the fact that the US has done well on subnational actions. And what are the kinds of institutional measures that have enabled this to happen? The question also is this applicable to India? It's a very specific question, but I think if we can learn what are the kinds of institutional things that have worked, it would be great. The second question, Andrew, and I think I will directly ask you, right now, the US is out of the Paris Agreement. Yes, President-elect Biden wants this would be his act on day one to get the US back in. What if there is a stumble? What happens to the US emissions in that case? Do they still keep reducing, albeit not at the rate at which they would if there was a coordinating mechanism, or is there a possibility that a coordinating mechanism and a national plan could be put into place without the Paris Agreement being there? And the third question, again, Andrew, and this is a very negotiations-based question, is with the US now almost on the verge of coming back into the Paris Protocol, with everything hopefully moving in that direction, the increased emphasis on mitigation effort and MRV, is this something that we will continue to see happen in the negotiating world? So without further ado, let me turn over to you, and Nate and Carla, first over to you, and then to you, Andrew, and then we'll open that up to the rest of the panelists.
Sure, and first of all, thanks to all of the other panelists for the great contributions, and really fantastic session, very thought-provoking on a number of levels. So let's dive into the conversation, the Q&A. Ajay, thanks for the question. I'm going to answer part of that, and I think I'll also ask Carla to help answer that question. So you asked a little bit about what are the policy mechanisms in the U.S., and I think this is where this kind of similar but different concept comes in. The U.S. is a federal system. There's ways in which other countries, have similar kinds of ways in which policy authorities are devolved or given down from the national government to various state levels, but it's all different in every country. Even countries that are purportedly federal, are federal, I should say, they manifest differently. So Canada's different, Brazil's different, US is different. So that's just sort of on the table. But in our situation, for example, states have a tremendous amount of authority over their electricity policies. So they can decide how much clean electricity happens in their own state. And it's in many ways what we've been seeing is that kind of authority being utilized, very much more vigorously than it had been before over the past few years. The other thing I would note, probably be able to fill in some more ideas on that front as well. The other thing I'll add is kind of connecting this question to the question of what's the U.S. kind of national strategy. So I worked in the Obama White House for a couple of years, and my job was to help build our NDC in the U.S., the 2025 NDC. And I think one of the things that we've learned is that this kind of integration of the regional or subnational strategies that Dr. Matsur, you mentioned, with the national strategies is going to be a new part of how we do this. And I would sort of offer, this is something that I believe will happen. Andrew should also comment, but regardless of any hiccups with the Paris Agreement, this is part of a national strategy that's rooted in a national political conversation. So I think there are going to be ways that this just, this is a moment that's different from 2013 or the kind of early sort of, lead up to Paris. So we do have new opportunities, and I think that this is going to be a more deeply rooted conversation across the entire economy now. Maybe I'll hand over to Carla to kind of continue answering that question.
Right. Thank you all. So a couple points here that I think are relevant globally is if we look at where we need to go in the US on climate, what we see is it will take all-in climate action by the federal government, as well as all-in climate action by states and cities and businesses, that subnational group, to get on a path to 1.5 alignment. And I think that's the case for many countries, that what the federal or national government can do is insufficient to get on the 1.5 path. So building that movement really helps. And part of that we've seen through the Alliances for Climate Action, those subnational movements coming together in Mexico, in Argentina, in South Africa, in Vietnam, in Japan. And all of those countries have very different situations about federal authorities versus subnational authorities. But the common element is that seeing those federal or national authorities works best when there's an all of society movement supporting that kind of effort. And in the US, we've seen this amazing coalition. So we've talked about states cities. It's also businesses and investors and artists and cultural institutions and universities and colleges. And that continued drumbeat and commitment and enthusiasm from all parties and all walks of life is what it's going to take to continue the momentum and accelerate to where we need to be.
Carla. Thanks, Carla. And Andrew?
Sure. So the first question was, what if the US stumbles getting back in the Paris Agreement? I don't think that that's actually possible, given how straightforward it is to re-enter Paris. There's a question that some may raise about, you know, people make a point about the adequacy of the US NDC, whatever it is, its next commitment to Paris, but that's a different issue. If the Paris Agreement did not exist, the US would still be, the Biden administration would be creating a national comprehensive plan on climate change, integrated with, I don't think there's any doubt. The second question about MRV, you know, one of the things that was actually there was bipartisan consensus on, going back several administrations in the United States, was that we wanted a strong MRV system which was as near universal as possible, right? Where there was not dramatic bifurcation between how countries are treated. And I think that's absolutely necessary. It'd be a longer conversation, but necessary to make the Paris Agreement work, where the commitments themselves are not legally binding under the agreement, but the binding part is the MRV. So, you know, when you look at the sort of the Republicans who wanted to keep the US in the Paris Agreement, when President Trump was elected in 2017, they focused on the MRV provisions and said, this is something that we don't want to let go of. And if the US gets out of the Paris Agreement, they might be weakened. So I don't think that changes at all. And I just want to go back and kind of add a little bit to what one of Navrosa's questions that he mentioned to me about whether or not there's a way of making, you know, the institutional structure in the United States more resilient to these political challenges. And you know, one thing, there will be discussions on that, and there's some discussions of ways of better integrating climate into all the agencies, so it's harder to dismantle it. But, you know, we've seen that, you know, one person can do a lot of damage if they're really determined to do it. Secondly, I think that there's going to be a renewed discussion in the United States of getting a climate policy that creates kind of more permanency like we see in entitlements. So, you know, although the environment is difficult for it in the United States right now, one of the advantages of like pricing and dividend schemes is if people are getting a check in the mail that comes from some pricing system, then this is one of the ways in which you get more buy-in, and it's harder to dismantle that. So there will be conversations about that. And then finally, just exactly what Nate and Carla said, is that, you know, when we were all thinking about what happens if Trump gets reelected, it was, how do you create, you know, more protection of what the states and cities and businesses are doing, the subnational, the non-federal entities are doing, so that you have something there as a backstop of whatever Trump was going to do in his second term. And that's interesting now, is I think all of us, it's dawned on us, especially with the threat of possibly the Republicans holding on to the Senate. We won't know until January 5th, but still with that threat is that this is now an essential part of Biden's climate plan and of long-term durability, because what you see is like there's less of this really ideological division over the importance of clean energy out there in the States, which is quite different than what you see in Washington.
Thanks, Andrew. We have very many more questions. So, Navroz, I think one of the questions I think you may start and then others may join in, relates to, for a country like India, are there trade-offs between the SDGs as far as climate action is concerned, or are we aligned as far as climate action is concerned? Would there be this kind of political tussle between different kinds of development goals that occur in society?
Thank you, Ajay. I think it's a great and in some ways a perennial question. And I think the answer is that in part, we have to find ways of maximizing the synergies and minimizing the trade-offs, right? So where it's very, sorry, I'm getting some feedback, Ajay. Is it possible to mute at your end? Sorry. So I think the key is to maximize the synergies and minimize the trade-offs to the extent possible. And so the kinds of things that I think where we really can see a lot of synergies are in areas like urbanization, building public transport systems, and so on. I think what's very important, though, and this is where our international conversation really matters, is that I think where what India has pushed for globally is that there recognition that there are some areas where we may actually, to meet our social needs, may need our emissions to rise. And the most interesting area there is probably cooking. So India has gone down the road of an expansion of access to cooking gas. And that transition from biomass to cooking has huge benefits from a developmental point of view. It probably does mean that it's more, that is carbon positive actually, of course, depending on the biomass. But that's the kind of trade-off that India needs to feel flexible, it needs to have the space to make, in a sense. Now, eventually we could move to electricity, it could be renewable electricity, so we may eventually get to the point where it's net zero carbon. But I think there'll be much more openness to thinking about how you maximize the synergies if India has a sense that we also can make some of these choices where in the short run our emissions do go up. And I see a question on the chat that says, where does one place equity in this conversation? And I think that's a very important point at which you place equity, right? So because of the equity conversation, India needs to have a little bit of flexibility where we make a judgment that our development needs need to be paramount at a given stage.
I think that's a great point. There are, it is the path to the net zero, which is more important. You said this earlier as well, and I think the example of the LPG use in cooking brings it out very, very clearly. But on the equity issue, Nate, Andrew, Carla, Emmanuel, Leon, any comments?
A very brief comment from me. Love to hear everybody else's views on this. And thanks to the question in the chat for raising this. I'm going to note that I think that the equity and justice angle is very salient in the United States right now. And that's primarily focused on a kind of U.S. just transitions and, shared prosperity discussion. And I think it's really been much between that and our other, what I call the four linked crises of the pandemic, the economic recession, climate change, and racial justice. I think there's a broader recognition that these are integrated in the U.S. context. It is also my hope that we will, as a global community, also be grappling with these questions more overtly. And I don't know how that's going to play out, but I think it's also really important as we're all sort of wrestling with the climate questions in our own national contexts to make sure that that's fully integrated. But other people, thoughts welcome.
Any other comments?
Yes, I'd be happy to pick up on that very, very important equity and justice issue. And I tend to agree with even the way the question has been framed, and Navros has started to answer it, which is that I think it's coming back. It's great that it is, because it's a central piece of how we should be looking at it. It is very important that we do not let it fall back into the traps of the past, where we knew that, good or bad intentioned people let that discussion on equity, which is absolutely vital, as I said, result in a complete deadlock. So I think it is on the rise. This is absolutely for sure. I mean, there is no doubt in my mind that this is the case. I very much agree with both Navros and Nate that this is coming back from two different perspectives, right? And let's see how we manage that. This is coming into the domestic political discussion, and this is coming into the international political discussion. And these are not exactly the same claims for justice, but I think, the part of me that is, not hopeful, but relentless activist, I guess, is think that you know, at the end of the day, if I'm reading honest about my reading from outside of the US elections, and because American friends have been asking, you know, what's the right thing for the US to project on the international scene as they come back, and in particular on climate. And I know that sometimes the option that is floated is like, you know, let's have the US to unpack, I mean, to take that commitment for 0 by 50 and then unpack what it means by sectors, by jurisdictions, the way Americans do that very well on electoral maps, etc. Maybe, and I'd love if that was the case. I've got the impression that there is a bigger picture story here, and it looks, I mean, again, from the outside, very curious to hear the thoughts from our American friends that, you know, the guy has been elected to heal the nation. I mean, you know, if words mean something, I mean, like he means it the time he makes the speech, and that's the most important thing to say at this stage. I find it extremely interesting that climate is part of the top 4 priorities as part of the transition team. I consider it equally an asset, to be honest, that you know, probably the single most important entry point in US politics for the next 4 years is going to be how do you bring people closer together on an issue like addressing climate change, or using other words, you know, or using other words and speak the language of jobs, etc., etc. And that, I think, in terms of, you know, like actual proof by example, that, you know, in a non-partisan way, because I don't think everybody expects the Republicans to play ball in the Senate. I mean, if they're sending a message right now, I mean, it's a message loud and clear that they will not play ball, and that's why they're gaining time, at least is my interpretation. But there is probably a way to find common ground in between American people, Indian people, European people on the platform, you know, including like the serious infrastructure or technology stuff that needs to get done. And I think that that's the message that I think like the world would hear very positively coming from the US, and I'm sure would resonate in India and Europe and a few other places. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Emmanuel. We are past the time when we needed to end. So let me first thank all our panelists and all our participants. I think we have had an extremely rich discussion. It is very, very clear that the world of today is very different from the world of 4 years ago. And I think one of the key issues, and this was brought out in the discussion that we had as we ended this session, the discussion on equity, is that national issues are now becoming part of the international negotiations. The dichotomy that we have had so far of national and international is disappearing. This is, I think, both good and bad, because it is bad in the sense that it will take longer to get an agreement. It is good in the sense that it will make for a lasting agreement. On that happy note, let me again thank each one of you, and we look forward to moving ahead together. Thank you all very much.
Thanks to you, Ajay, and always behind you. Thanks for the great work.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ajay. Everyone.